Alrighty, so welcome. Obviously moved on now, lesson 9. This is going to be our second lesson on the Jehovah's Witnesses, and as you can see on the screen before us, we're looking at the organisation itself, okay? The Watchtower organisation, or the religion of the Jehovah's Witnesses as an organisation, as a body. It'll be, again, much like with last week, we're kind of at a 35,000 foot cruising altitude, just giving an overview. Much of what's going to be the focus here today will be on who they are, some of the basic core tenets. We're not going to dive into that, that'll be for the theology lesson specifically, but you'll get at least a basic understanding of core JW doctrine, as well as some of its hierarchy, especially because of how public their interactions are and who you likely to interact in, and it's helpful to understand how some of that works. We'll also be introducing some of the more historic elements of the organisation, especially around toward the latter end of the lesson, some of the notorious, infamous, failed prophecies that have kind of come and gone. There's 3 big ones, along with others which we'll look at in other lessons as well. But we're kind of having an overview of the organisation to help us understand who they are, and then we can start to look at what they believe in those coming lessons that will come down the pipe in the coming weeks. All right. So let's begin. Some of this we've already seen. Obviously, last week we looked at Charles Taze Russell specifically. He's the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses themselves. In this particular case here, founded in 1881, formally incorporated in 1844, but they go back to the late 19th century nonetheless. Their official name was actually only codified in 1931 by Russell's successor, a man named Joseph Rutherford, or otherwise known in JW circles as Judge Joseph Rutherford. He has a similar relationship to Charles Taze Russell as does Brigham Young to Joseph Smith in Mormonism. He's the kind of successor. We mentioned him when we were looking at Mormonism. He's the next president of the organisation that comes along and not only continues the work of Russell, but really actually expands it, enhances it, doubles down on a lot of the kind of hardline autocratic elements. His time and tenure in leading that organisation through the 1920s and 1930s was even controversial in his own day contemporaneously. We'll touch a bit on that towards the end as well. Its governing body, which was mentioned last week in its seedling form with the Bible Student Movement, which was the predecessor organisation to that of what we now call the Jehovah's Witnesses, being renamed in 1931. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, these days is based in New York. Of course, the JWs were founded in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, like we saw last week, so we're in pretty similar territory, of course, to that of Mormonism's foundings in Western New York State. These days, and again, these are the most current numbers I could find online, but nevertheless, their current stated membership is about 8.8 million, globally that is, of course. The Kingdom Halls, which is a term you'll hear me use across these coming lessons, Kingdom Halls are what they refer to as basically their local churches. They refer to it for their own kind of doctrinal reasons. They have 118,767 as of at least last year. So let's just round it off and call it about 120,000 Kingdom Halls, or churches, congregations around the world. Of course, a number here in Australia as well. And they're missionaries, so those who are actually specifically dedicated to going to foreign nations. These are not necessarily the folk who you'll just encounter in the local area. They're just local congregants. But missionaries that are explicitly sent out around. The most recent statistics I could find were from 2021, where they had approximately 4,000 or so. Okay, the JWs on that note have attempted, especially in the last decade or so, to make considerable inroads into Africa and into the Pacific. Elsewhere, of course, but at least more in a concentrated form in those areas of Africa and the Pacific. The Mormons are very heavily focused in the Pacific as well, actually, especially in places like Fiji, for example. So these different kind of restorationist cults and groups heavily target a lot of the areas that we've been in for quite a while now. But that's the basic kind of overview, giving you an understanding of the organisation. About half the membership, roughly speaking, nearly of Mormonism, which is about somewhere between 15 to 20,000, 15 to 20 million globally. These days, as I said, sits at about that 9 million figure, roughly globally. All right, moving on. So this is the core doctrines area. Again, like I said, we're not going to go into it in depth, but this will give you a basic understanding at the organisational level, the big picture, what their kind of basic tenets are, and we'll explain a little bit at least here about what those mean. So in terms of their view of God, they are what we call Unitarian monotheists. So I'll break this down in our understanding. We as Christians are what we call Trinitarian monotheists. In the case of, starting with us, Trinitarian, right? So we believe in the Trinity, we believe that God exists as three persons, but is only one divine essence or one divine nature. So monotheism. Monos, meaning one, theos, God, one God. Monotheism, right? Such like a monorail, like you used to have back in the day, right? From that Greek term monos, meaning one, okay? So in this case, however, obviously the difference is in that first descriptor, we are Trinitarians, they are what's called Unitarians. Again, fairly simple in this case from the Latin, from the prefix tri, meaning three, like a triangle. In the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses, they are Unitarians, uni, meaning one or singular, so university, for example. A Unitarian monotheist, again, they're not the only ones. The Jews are Unitarian monotheists by definition. Muslims are Unitarian monotheists by definition, for example, as are a number of others. In this case, their reference to God is as the word Jehovah. We're not going to look at that too much today. That'll be more when we look at the New World Translation specifically, their version of the Bible. We'll look at more of those words and phrases, some of the particular linguistic details there, okay? But as far as the JWs are concerned, there is one God, and he exists as one person, that is Jehovah, okay? Their Christology, or in other words, their beliefs about Jesus, they are Arian, so they do believe that Jesus is a created being. They also have a very interesting belief, and a unique belief that was largely unheard of prior to their time, that Jesus and the Archangel Michael, who features in Daniel chapter 10, Daniel chapter 12, and the book of Revelation, at least by name. He is elsewhere, just not in that specific reference. But at least in the end of Daniel, in the Old Testament and in Revelation, that Jesus and the Archangel Michael are actually the same person. Okay? We'll talk more about the theology later, but essentially their belief is that prior to the incarnation, he was the Archangel Michael. He then became Jesus on earth, and then they have a whole host of set of beliefs what happens beyond the resurrection and the ascension as well. We'll leave that for the theology section specifically. But the important part, though, is that, again, they are classically Arian. Going back, of course, many of you have been here for our early church period when we were on the church history course. They believe that Jesus is a created being. They do not believe Jesus is eternally God. They do not believe that he is the first and the last, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, all those references to him in Revelation. They either change the translation or they have reinterpretations of what that means. But long story short, they're classically Arian in that respect, okay? So that's something they share in common with the Mormons and other groups. In regards to the Holy Spirit, the important doctrinal belief on their part is the impersonality of the Spirit. In other words, they believe that he is an impersonal force, okay? He doesn't have personhood, there's no distinct personhood to the Holy Spirit. There's no mind, there's no discernible action, there's no will, to be more specific, so no mind and no will. I offer the analogy, and I'm not trying to be rude with it, it's just the kind of the most apt comparison. The view of the Holy Spirit in Jehovah's Witnesses doctrine is almost akin to that of electricity, an impersonal force, okay, with no mind and no will. There's no personhood, in other words. That's why I say that phrase, no distinct personhood, okay? So there is Jehovah, one God. There is then Jesus, who is a created being, elevated, honoured, all these kinds of things. That's classical Arian belief, but not God. And then the Holy Spirit is an impersonal force with no mind and no will, okay? More on that when we get into those lessons. In terms of soteriology, the next section. So soteriology is the theology of salvation, from the Greek word soter, meaning to save, right? It's a very heavily works-based system. I don't want to touch too much on this, but the lines between justification and sanctification are very blurred in Jehovah's Witness doctrine. And much like we saw with Mormonism, the almost never-ending list of what we call efficacious works, in other words, works that are effective to salvation itself, is very extensive in the JWs, just like it is with Mormons, okay? Heaven, and this is perhaps what they're maybe even best known for, apart from the distinction of the name Jehovah, is the 144,000. I'll give you at least, I will touch on it a little bit because it's worth mentioning, and we'll talk more about it in those doctrinal lessons. But their fundamental belief originally was that the 144,000 that is made reference to in the book of Revelation, if you're familiar, for starters, they interpreted it very differently, which is that it's a literal number, whereas the church historically understood it to be symbolic of 12,000 multiplied by 12, or simply 12 times 1,000, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, the totality of the church multiplied by the number 1,000, which in the book of Revelation, as with elsewhere in the Old Testament as well, is used to describe a large number or a complete number for reasons which I'll explain when we get to those doctrinal lessons. They decided to interpret it literally instead, and that was the number of Jehovah's Witnesses, which is where the name actually comes from, okay, because the 144,000 witnesses from the book of Revelation. This is where their name is specifically coming from, as well as certain Old Testament texts as well. Problem is, however, they eventually got to more than 144,000, so they had to figure out what do we do? What do we do with this doctrine? Well, of course, as you will consistently see, just like we saw with the Mormons, they have to reinvent the wheel, and they have to go back and reinterpret things. So these days, it's even more esoteric, where they refer to the 144,000 as the elect. So they borrow the term from Paul's epistles, which is standard Christian doctrine, and they apply that specifically to the literal 144,000. The rest of the faithful then live on earth. Okay, so the 144,000 go to heaven. The rest of the faithful Jehovah's Witnesses live down here on the earth. That's a later development, right? They originally believed it was only 144,000, but once their numbers surpassed that, they had to reinterpret their own doctrine, and it came to kind of have this partitioning, which is exactly what happens in the Mormon doctrine as well. You remember the three kingdoms: the celestial, the terrestrial, and the telestial kingdom, right? This kind of ranking and partitioning of the afterlife. This is what the Jehovah's Witnesses also had to do by necessity. We'll talk more about that funny aspect when we get onto those lessons. The next section, obviously, in opposition to heaven, is hell. Now, you may remember from last week's lesson that the big sticking point for Charles Taze Russell was on the doctrine of hell. That was the very thing that caused him to go down this kind of heretical rabbit hole. Obviously, he laid the foundation for that doctrine. It's still standard doctrine for the JWs to this day. They deny the existence of hell. So there's no eternal judgment or punishment. It's a concept or an idea or a doctrine, what's called in kind of religious terminology as annihilationism. So the fundamental belief, in short at least, is that the great day of judgment occurs, the wicked are then annihilated from existence. Okay? Part of that has to do with their belief about the soul, or more specifically the immaterial world, so the spiritual nature, in contrast to, well, effectively in contrast to almost every single religion in the world, quite frankly, almost, they don't believe that the spiritual essence or nature of anything is actually eternal. That I will need to leave till the other lesson. So they don't believe in the immortality of spiritual essence. They believe that spiritual essence has a mortality, just like the physical. Okay? Hence why, philosophically, in their view, the wicked are able to be annihilated, in other words, removed from existence. Okay? 1,000 philosophical problems with that. We'll talk about that when we get to it. Second to last section, eschatology. So eschatology, in other words, theology of the world, theology of the end of time, the end of the world. It's more than just that, but that's essentially what it is. The eschatology from the Greek eschaton, meaning last things. They believe that Christ began to rule invisibly in the world in 1914. I'll talk more about that specifically actually at the end of this lesson. And then lastly, one of the more notable aspects is a lot of their medical beliefs. They have medical, I just called it medical, I don't know what else to call it. Medical doctrines are actually quite highly developed in the Jehovah's Witnesses. One of the more notable ones is one I've referenced there, which is the refusal for blood transfusions. They're quite famous for it. Even if the diagnosis and even later on prognosis is that they will surely die if they don't get their transfusion, they will definitely refuse it. That has to do with the basic belief for them of taking verses like "the life is in the blood," which is just a phrase that features in the Old Testament, which at least is fundamentally true, of course, right? Hence why we have that term lifeblood. But again, like with everything else, and you'll notice this when we get to the doctrinal lessons, the hyperliterality of the 19th century, for reasons that we actually kind of covered in Mormonism already, but we'll touch on in those other lessons. The rebound, the kind of big pendulum swing that occurs in 19th century America in the face of theological liberalism, so in other words, everyone taking everything to be completely allegorical, right, which is an equally incorrect interpretive method for the Bible. The big pendulum swing was to go the opposite direction and just take everything literally, which is why you get a literal 144,000 when no one used to do it that way. Or you take life is in the blood and go, well, we'll create the doctrine that if someone has a blood transfusion, then the blood is leaving the body and I'm taking life from someone else, because after all, life is in the blood, and that would be murder, therefore I can't have a blood transfusion. That's the doctrine. So it's tantamount to murder because you're taking life from someone else, right? This is the problem. That's one of the more cruel and oppressive doctrines that come out of this. But nevertheless, that's a little tiny snapshot for you. Okay, like I said, we're going to go into all that in the doctrinal lessons, but I wanted you to at least get a little bit of an idea of some of the core basic tenets or doctrines of the JW. So we'll leave it to the rest of that and leave it for the other lessons, all right? So we'll move on from there. The organisational structure itself. The JWs, the Watchtower, explicitly describes itself as a theocratic organisation. So theocracy, again, much like we have other words, democracy, oligarchy, monarchy, etc. Theocracy from that root word theos, right, and kratos meaning power. So they believe fundamentally that the JW organisation, or the church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, is itself a theocratic organisation, much akin to the Israelites in the wilderness or the Israelites in the days of the judges, for example. Right? So that's the comparison they're attempting to draw. It's governed by a body, what they call the governing body, which always has eight gentlemen on that council. They're all themselves JW elders who become governors, and they are viewed, again, this is what we kind of colloquially call the Watchtower Society, or the Watchtower just simply. It is viewed as the divine institution on earth as God's representative to the world. Beneath that, you then have different branch committees that essentially oversee kind of national territories, so the United States or Canada or Australia, whatever it is. These are much like in the Episcopal model of church governance, what are called provinces. So, for example, the Anglican province of Australia, or the Anglican province of Kenya, the Anglican province of Canada, etc. And so those branch committees then oversee national territories for them. Down beneath that, the actual church circuit overseers. Overseers, that same word where we get the word bishop from ultimately as well from the Greek. But these circuit overseers kind of oversee a group of kingdom halls in a region, kind of like what would be a diocese, an Anglican diocese, for example. So maybe I don't know what it is specifically, the breakdown in Sydney / the Blue Mountains here, but obviously the kingdom hall up here is in North Katoomba. It would be part of that particular JW circuit with the rest of the mountains, probably maybe some of Western Sydney or something out to Bathurst. I don't know what the specific breakdown is in this context, but it would be part of that overall circuit, and it would be overseen by a number of overseers. The elders and ministerial servants, you can think of them like deacons essentially. Elders and ministerial servants, they then actually manage that local kingdom hall or that local congregation. It's essentially equivalent to our elders and deacons, or pastors and deacons. And then, of course, you just have the regular members, so congregants, who obviously make up the bulk of the organisation. Right? So its structure is actually much more akin, it's kind of a hybrid between a Presbyterian model and so the Presbyterian Church and others, for example, Reformed churches, Lutheran churches as well, most of them, and a blend between that and what's called the Episcopal model, so something like what the Anglicans use, for example, or Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, etc. Some Lutherans as well. It's kind of a hybrid almost, but it definitively describes itself as a theocratic organisation, and that's what kind of gives the Watchtower up the top and its governing body the kind of power to then enact that. They are the ones who enact that theocratic hierarchy and keep the rest of it in check and in balance and in line, as it were, right? The people who you're likely to encounter, obviously, are just regular members. So that's what I'm saying to you. I was drawing that distinction earlier on in the overview. The missionaries are those who get sent out to wherever in the world. The people whom you're likely to encounter either door to door or at their little kind of public stations that they set up, like they have at Katoomba at the moment, are just regular Joe Schmo congregants. Sometimes they'll often be, well, usually, especially in the stationary sense, they'll always be accompanied by an elder, right? So I've almost never seen a case where that hasn't been the case. And in really important areas, they don't let regular congregants or regular members do that. It'll only be elders and ministerial servants, sometimes even like circuit overseers. So when I was in the city a couple of weeks ago, I had a chat with the JWs who were down there outside the Queen Victoria building near Town Square on George Street, and they were actual circuit overseers from the main Kingdom Hall in the city, right? Which makes sense because they want to give prime real estate to their most experienced guys, right? Up here would be a different story. So finding out who you're talking to often is a good objective to do early on, because you can then get a bit of a lay of the land as to who you're talking to, how much knowledge they do and don't have. We'll talk about all that in the more practical sessions, right? About how to actually talk to the JWs, right? So let's move on. Some of their practices, so the actual religious practices themselves, of course, evangelism is what they're very heavily known for, especially the door-to-door variety. I have no idea what, their current door-to-door practices are. I think I mentioned this last week. My house has been blacklisted from their door-to-door program. It has been for many, many years. I had a interaction. This is almost a decade ago now that we've had visitors in about a decade. I've seen them around, but just not coming to my place. My first interaction was with a lovely young single mother, I assume, otherwise she would have been out there with her husband, with her 3 children. God bless her, and despite obviously being very polite and very cordial and doing my very best to be tame and civil, it was kind of being fed to the sharks for her. And the next time that came around, I actually got 2 of the elders from the Kingdom Hall who came around the next time, which was a much more fruitful, at least intellectually stimulating conversation. And from there, blacklisted. So they still do the door-to-door preaching. That's their big, heavy thing. What that looks like obviously changes. It's actually the reason why they do it, though. This is the important part. It's counted towards what they call field service, right? So field is in like the kind of harvesting imagery from the Bible. Every Jehovah's Witness, no matter who they are, has kind of mandatory required field service hours they need to complete, evangelism hours, which in one sense is not a bad thing per se. It's just a matter of how they go about that and how they enforce that with the kind of cultic rigidity we would say to do. But it encourages strongly their members to constantly get out there, right? Do more, do more, do more. We've kind of saw that concept with the Mormon elders when we looked at them, right? Young 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old young men in the prime of their life are compared to the Mormon missionaries from the days of the Book of Mormon and said, like we saw in those lessons, these guys are the model. You need to get out there and at least even try and be half as active as they are, and that spurs them on to action. The JWs are very similar in that regard, right? So heavy on the evangelism side, constantly trying to evangelize and bring people in. Their methods of specifically how they do that have shifted greatly. They've tempered down a lot of their overt rhetoric. They've actually taken a page out of the Mormons book, which is 100 years ago, Mormons and JWs were very much known for their distinction, right? We are not, kind of to speak as them, we're not like those Christians, those heretics who are part of that false church, because of course their view is that the church has been restored through Joseph Smith, or if you ask the JWs, Charles Hedge Russell, right? And it's this distinction. The distinction was actually part of their evangelism. Now, though, through the latter half of the 20th century, of course, now into the 21st century, they've actually flipped the script. They're actually much more, in terms of their marketing, trying to paint themselves as just another Christian denomination that maybe you should check out. That's the kind of way of going about it. So their language and their rhetoric, including especially in their published material, is very low-key, very watered down, use a lot of the language that we do. So methods change, but their basic essence of evangelism, of that kind of public-facing evangelism, heavy as a mandatory aspect, is core to the whole concept of the Jehovah's Witnesses aspect, the witness kind of part, right? Their meetings, what they call their meetings, what we, I guess, would just call a kind of a church service or a liturgy. They have 5 weekly meetings, which is condensed into 2 kind of sessions for each one. You don't need to worry about specifically what that actually kind of literally looks like, but it's not terribly dissimilar to ours, right? It's songs, it's Bible readings, it's sermons, it's other things like that. But they're very, very active throughout the week in those meetings. That shouldn't be, well, it's kind of a bit of a surprise today because we, a lot of the time, only meet on Sundays for worship. We have other events throughout the week. Historically speaking, in Christianity, you would go to church every single day. There are reasons why that has shifted, and across the rest of my life in the 21st century, I'd like to see it shift into a more historic direction. But nevertheless, obviously throughout all of their meetings, published material from the Watchtower Society kind of remains central to what they do, right? And what they actually refer to as their Watchtower study, which is kind of like what we would call a Bible study, essentially. In this case, they're studying the Watchtower material about the Bible, right? So it always has, you're already seeing, hopefully, the kind of centrality that the Watchtower organisation up the top has in terms of controlling the whole thing. Holidays and birthdays are a big no-no. Birthdays and other such holidays like Easter and Christmas and pick anything else, Ascension, Pentecost, All Saints, blah, 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 are all viewed as pagan or otherwise worldly. They are half right, though, I will say, in regards to birthdays. Birthdays, technically speaking, are of pagan origin, and that is actually functionally true. Christians, historically speaking, have not celebrated birthdays. They've instead celebrated what's called a name day or a saint's day. So, for example, if you were... there's all kinds of different examples, but if you were named after Michael or something, or if you were named John, or if you were named Peter, your day of celebration would be whichever day was honouring the Apostle Peter or the Apostle James or John or whoever it happened to be, right? That would be when you would celebrate. So it connected you to Christian history, connected you to the past. It was really only wealthy pagans, and especially pagan kings and emperors, whoever had their birthdays celebrated, because that was some event that needed to be celebrated of that king's entrance into the world. That's not necessarily an all-out condemnation of birthdays. It's just a thing. But anyway, the other ones, more importantly, of the kind of typical 19th century rigmarole, which is where that idea pops up of Easter and Christmas being of pagan origin, apart from the fact that it's got exactly zero evidence to support that idea historically, it is very much in vogue with what the time period was, right? The idea came about in the 19th century in the UK and especially the USA that Christmas and Easter were of pagan origin. They were just old pagan festivals repackaged by Constantine and the Roman Empire to take over Christianity, and the problem is that none of that's true. And when I mean none, I do literally mean none. There's not one shred of historical evidence to support any of that. Christmas and Easter are, shock horror, Christian holidays. But yes, so those kinds of things are absolutely... So they never do Christmas, they don't do Easter, they don't do any of those things, including for that reason of viewing them in that typical 19th century as pagan or worldly. Politics, very strict adherence to political neutrality. So no voting, but even beyond the actual democratic function or the political function, so no voting, including all to anything politics. No flags. You'd never have, a Jehovah's Witness would never have an Australian flag, say for example, on a flagpole outside their house or in their house even. They're expressly forbidden from saluting flags or saluting anything else in terms of visages or images, so like an image of the king, formerly Queen, of course, all those kinds of things. Other political figures, absolutely not on. So that, of course, excludes a number of things like military service. So Jehovah's Witnesses are expressly forbidden from serving in any military. There's essentially no loophole to that. So political neutrality is due to something, because again, politics is worldly. So you can see this kind of whole the hyper-separatist, kind of theme that's incumbent in Jehovah's Witnesses. And then just finally on this, touching is part of, obviously, the literature. We looked a little bit at that in the whole Bible student movement and the Watchtower Society when we were talking about Charles Taze Russell last week. But in terms of literature, the actual practical part I want to talk about is their total and utter dependence on Watchtower material, right? So it's not just merely that they have their own publishing organisation, the Watchtower, that controls everything. They are expressly forbidden from reading anything else, almost anything else, that's not published by the Watchtower. So they're not, and that goes for trivial things like movies or TV shows, to actual more substantive materials like especially if it's in contradiction or if it's anything that's even vaguely critical of the Watchtower or the Jehovah's Witnesses as an organisation, expressly forbidden. You can absolutely get excommunicated, what they call getting shunned, from your kingdom hall and from your family for even being caught with those kinds of materials on your person. I've known people like that. I've known people who have been Jehovah's Witnesses who have been not even figuratively, but like literally exiled from their families for having like a single book. Yeah, it gets quite wild. It depends, and again, this ebbs and flows throughout JW history, how strict, how lenient, right? So there's different time periods, but the majority of that has been very strict. That's why I kind of use the term total dependence, because generally throughout JW history for the last century or so, you can effectively describe it as total dependence on Watchtower material, right? So they're extremely controlling in regards to the literature. I'm using that in a very generic term. It's really media these days is what we call media. But literature/media, they're extremely tightly controlling of, okay? And that's one of the more obvious, not the only one, but it's one of the more obvious cultic practices, right? Obviously in Christianity, like to try and steel man part of the point here, obviously there's no shortage of material which we strongly recommend you don't partake of, right, for just the general sense of it not being beneficial to you spiritually, physically or otherwise, right? However, in this context, the predominance of what this really kind of functionally means is the absolute forbiddenness of any partaking of any material which might ever vaguely critique the Watchtower. That's what that effectively means. It's not just that. That's really what it's kind of centred on, right? Whereas, again, within reason, you can read whatever material you want that's critical of Christianity or that's trying to debunk it. It's not necessarily that I encourage you to do it, but go right ahead, because I don't have any fear that it's going to actually convince you of anything otherwise, right? Can such materials lead people astray? Of course they can, but that's only inherent in the word leading astray. The reality is that the world in various cultures have been attempting to produce all kinds of material for thousands of years against the church, and none of it's worked. So I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. The reality is that most people who seek to try and disprove Christianity end up ironically finding themselves becoming Christian if they actually do a genuine and thorough study or analysis, especially from a historical point, but let alone a linguistic or a philosophical one or theological one. But that's how you control an organ. Again, they're very, very tight on their information control. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And you'll see kind of how that plays out. But that's one of the ways in which once they get people in, they keep them in. Okay? Control what information they do or don't even have access to, and you can keep a pretty good control on the group, right? So let's keep going. This is a good transition because it gets us onto some of those cultic practices, right? Those, or just calling it cult characteristics. I've subdivided into four main sections, right? The first of which, just to briefly touch on, is behavioural control. So again, much like with the Mormons, very lengthy and very tightly controlled, very severe regulation of all manner of things to do with dress and grooming, speech, association, so who they associate with, who they're seen with, even in the context of just like friends or social other things. Obviously dating, employment, education, there are various other ways as well. And again, inherently there are also decent things to that. Obviously higher education is extremely discouraged, not disallowed per se, it depends what it is, but historically speaking they don't go to higher education because it's viewed as, again, worldly, pagan, spiritually kind of dangerous. Without being smart these days, they're basically right, so I actually give them that point as a tick, but that's aside the point. The point is, though, however, is that what that actually kind of functionally looks like on the whole is the very tight and strict regulation of every single facet of your life, okay? In order to control behaviour itself of what you are and are not even engaging in, right? And it's beyond just basic morality and principle, because again, we have that, but I'm not sitting here each week getting a checkup of exactly your itinerary throughout the week and what you've been doing. That's not how this works, right? And it's not just because we're libertines and we don't care. No, it's because there's an actual biblical balance to how this works, right? That's a whole different ballgame in the JWs. That, of course, feeds in strictly as well to the concept of interpreting the Bible. Now, again, to give them somewhat of an olive branch, as a general principle, independent biblical interpretation, like you just sitting down yourself and just deciding what this Bible passage does or doesn't mean, is also in general a bad idea. God has given teachers and pastors in the church, he's given church history, he's given us logic. There's all different aspects of ways in which we learn these things that have been given for us to be able to learn and to grow. So the strict kind of regulation of individual private interpretation is actually not necessarily a bad thing. However, it is in the context in which they apply it, because from their view, by their, I mean the Watchtower, they are making sure that no one inside the organisation has a little question pop up in the back of their head as to whether or not they're being told what they're told by the Watchtower is true or not, right? That's what it's for, okay? When we, as clergymen, do the work of aiding the interpretation, it's to try and help you grow and learn and to help you avoid the pitfalls that people have fallen into in times past. It's not to make sure that you never question what I've been saying about, but that's not, no, it's a completely different purpose behind it, right? So the actual principle behind the practice is what's really the problem here, right? But behavioural control is a huge thing, especially when I talk about things like association, right? JWs will get in trouble all the time for being seen out in public with someone they shouldn't be seen with, namely a non-JW. It doesn't even necessarily be someone of ill repute, right? Because again, from the Watchtower's perspective, being out for coffee with that friend from work is just one step along the path toward you seeing what life is like outside the JWs and maybe having someone question something, or maybe having a conversation that raises a doubt in your mind, and that's the path toward apostasy from the JWs. You know what I'm saying too? So it's not like they're taking solid advice of, like, you know, bad company corrupts good morals. No, it's well beyond that, right? And so that absolute eagle-eyed control over all facets of behaviour and lifestyle is something that is replete throughout that organisation. So that's point A, behavioural control. Next section, section B, informational control. I kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, right? But as I mentioned earlier, they're absolutely prohibited from reading any what they consider apostate literature. So in other words, anything critical of the organisation of the Watchtower or the JWs as a whole. So this extends, obviously I've just listed a couple of things, but this extends to things like internet forums, it extends to books, it extends to various different forms of media. So these days you can think of things like podcasts, YouTube videos, radio programs, TV shows, you name it, right? That's expressly banned, including as well, of course, the questioning of it, the questioning of those kind of things. And that even has some very interesting implications as well, right? So there are a number of countries that have outright banned legally the JW organisations. So there were groups or nations like Russia has, Norway has, a number of African nations have outlawed Jehovah's Witnesses. There's a number of countries in like I said, Russia and Norway are the European ones. There's a number of African nations as well, where, and technically speaking, a number of Middle Eastern nations have as well, although not literally on paper, but effectively they have. And so material from those countries is also almost kind of by extension or by proxy then viewed as illicit, right? So engaging or utilising things from Russia or Norway, I've had that conversation with JWs before, by extension, because those places have banned or outlawed the JWs. So that's the kind of idea we're getting at. Interestingly, on top of that, in terms of information control, everything that the Watchtower produces, so all of the Watchtower literature is actually viewed as and interpreted as infallible in itself, right? Because again, in this theocratic model of the JWs, the Watchtower is God's supreme representative on earth and has the actual capability of infallibility. We explained this in lessons past, but to remind you, infallibility and inerrancy, kind of two sides of the same coin, right? Inerrancy without error, so I say that 1 + 1 = 2. I've spoken inerrantly, but it's not because I'm infallible. In other words, incapable of fallacy or being wrong, right? What I said is inerrant, but it's not because I'm infallible. When God says that 1 + 1 = 2, it's because he is infallible, right? So everything he says is inerrant because he's infallible. We as people can be inerrant, but we're not infallible, right? We can be wrong, but it doesn't mean we are wrong, right? In this case, however, they ascribe infallibility, which is only limited to God, to the Watchtower, including, obviously, what that practically means is it's literature that it publishes, right? Hence why to question the literature is to question the Watchtower, and to question the Watchtower is to question God. Ta-da. Right? That's how this works, right? In our context, questioning the authority of the church is very, very serious. It is, that's true, right? Questioning, especially if it's on more moral grounds, questioning the morality or the integrity of a clergyman is also serious, unless it's obviously true, right? But it doesn't mean it's something that should be treated lightly. However, to question the clergy or to question the church, capital C church, as an organisation, is not itself tantamount to questioning God. Right? There's a distinction, right? It's extremely serious to do that, and you'd better make sure you're right, because you can be right, because there are times, because we are fallible, we're not infallible, right? But it is a serious issue nonetheless that can still happen. However, it's not tantamount to questioning God, right? Even though the church is the body of Christ. So I'm saying it is serious, but they're two distinct things. That distinction technically exists in JW theology, but in practice, not really, right? In practice, those lines are blurred beyond visage, right? That's how this works. So the informational control is maybe even more strict and severe than the behavioural control. It's really the bedrock, the informational control itself, right? So that's section B, right? Section C, mental control. Obviously, you can see how this feeds in through informational control. Like, there's a lot of confluence, obviously. But questioning JW theology in literally any regard, and or the Watchtower, like I was just mentioning, is routinely viewed as apostasy and rebellion, right, in its kind of seedling form, against Jehovah himself. That's what I was just kind of trying to describe to us just a moment ago, right? The way that they work on this, especially through that informational aspect, in making sure they control the mental lives of their people, is in regards to language. It's not something unique to the JWs. This is how any cult works, quite frankly. But training them on in-group rhetoric, or in-group language, as it's called in technical terms. So in other words, the kind of lingo that people who are part of the in-group, so the in favour with the group, use to keep each other in check, right? This happens at all kinds of levels, some of them trivial, some of them serious. A group of teenage guys and a group of teenage girls have their own in-group lingo that gets used, right? It's a way of social regulation. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it gets abused, right? But that's a natural thing. This is where you take that concept of in-group language and then use it very subtly as a kind of electric fence, almost, right? If someone starts using different rhetoric and different language, it stands out like a sore thumb, because everyone's reading off the same script, if that makes sense. I'm speaking colloquially, of course, right? So those who start talking differently start to stand out as obvious. Now, why would that be important? I'll give you the very simple philosophical lesson on it. Obviously, all speech is preceded by thought, even if it's thoughtless, as we might say, right? If someone blurts out something that they don't mean, right, they're in an argument and they say something because they're emotionally fired up, whatever, that's only coming because you've put your thought process on the back burner and now you're just leading with emotion. So it's still proceeding from the mental. What that really means is all speech proceeds from the mind, okay? Consciously, unconsciously, thoughtfully, or not as thoughtfully as we should do, it doesn't really matter. That's philosophically how that works. Therefore, when someone is saying something, it's giving you an image of some kind of what's going on in their mind. Okay? Philosophically, that's just fundamentally true. This is why in-group language works so well in terms of controlling an organisation, in that if you have a very tightly regulated rhetoric and in-group language, when someone starts using other words and speaking differently, it stands out and it shows you that their thinking is starting to travail outside the group. Do you understand what I mean? Right? Very clever psychological tactic, or mental tactic in this case. And so the kind of hard-line distinction between us, the JWs, and the world, right? How they define the kind of capital T truth, how they talk about the literature as spiritual food, all these kinds of things. When someone starts using rhetoric that diverts from the normal way that JWs talk to each other, it shows that person is starting to shift in their thinking away from what the group is doing. Okay? That's how they catch people out. And so especially when it comes to along that line of thinking, things like doubts, right? Having questions, because obviously questions come from doubts. The doubt, I'm using doubt in a very broad sense here. So doubt in this context I mean by either doubting prior information or ignorance. So in other words, doubt more in the historic sense, like not knowing something. So being in doubt about something, meaning I don't know this information, can you please explain it to me, right? I'm using a more broader term of the sense of doubt here. But doubts, right, questions, just use a simple term, is then of course out-group language. People in the group don't question. We accept, we listen, we obey, we submit, right? So questions are automatically, and not good-hearted questions, but questioning in that sense is automatically indicative that someone's thought process is starting to move outside the group. Hence why doubts or questioning, right, what they call doubts, is immediately framed as kind of, in this kind of case, a form of basically spiritual divergence. It's viewed as a sense of apostasy, right? It's viewed as demonic influence. It's viewed as a kind of spiritual weakness even as well, right? Because the faithful believe, the unfaithful doubt. That's the kind of view of things, right? Now again, the Bible does talk in part in that kind of way, but not in the way that the JWs then interpret that way, right? So the way that the Bible speaks of doubts is in a negative context when rightly understood, right? So when it speaks of doubt, it does pretty clearly communicate doubt as a lack of faith, right, or as the opposite of faith in that sense. However, what it does, though, is it doesn't put a gun to the doubter's head and say, fix this now or you're done. What it does is it instead comes along and the Word of God encourages the doubter to trust in God and to place their faith. Again, faith and trust are entirely synonymous, especially when you get into the Greek understanding of the term, right? Pistis, meaning faith or trust or even loyalty. It encourages. It doesn't try to squash the doubt as immediate apostasy. What it does is it recognizes, talking about the Bible, the Bible recognizes that doubt is a consequence or a byproduct of our human frailty. It's a consequence of our own mortality. It's a consequence of our own fallenness. And instead of destroying us beneath the shame or the guilt of that doubt, what it does is God encourages us to trust God in the face of our doubts, right? Interestingly, to finalize this point, the way that the Bible actually describes doubt in relation to faith is actually the exact same way, at least kind of typologically and thematically, that courage is related to fear. Okay? Ad infinitum, the Bible says, do not fear. Right? This happens when prophets or apostles, in these very rare instances, encounter an angel, and they just fall to the ground in utter fear of this being that is much more powerful than them. Angel says, get up, do not fear, right? Or we get more generic examples, like, of course, famously in Joshua, right? Do not fear, instead be strong and courageous, right? To paraphrase, okay? So strength and courage are the antidote to fear, right? Courage is not the absence of fear, not explicitly. It is strength in the face of fear. It's perseverance in spite of fear, right? The men who stormed Gallipoli, the men who stormed the beaches of Normandy, the men who have fought in just about any war ever, unless they have been so broken and shattered by life that they no longer fear anything, which itself is its own problem, every man fears when he steps onto the battlefield. Okay, that's a basic essence. No matter how tough, no matter how well trained, no matter how battle-hardened a warrior is, they have an element of fear. In fact, it's usually a problem when they don't. We had examples like this in recent vintage in the global war on terror, where our special forces operators were so used to going out in the battlefield doing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 missions a night that eventually they would get to the point where, after long enough, they would be flying in on a helicopter in the middle of the night to go and assault a target, and they would be asleep, right? Because they're so used to flying in and so used to the concept that the next door I walk through could have a suicide vest on the far side, and one click can be the end of my life, that they get so used to that all of the neurochemicals, all the epinephrine, all the adrenaline, just, right? And it's a real problem because they no longer have a fear response, and they no longer actually make worse decisions, because what would normally regulate that fear and go, hold on, there could be a machine gun on the far side here, they just roll right through that door with no fear and die. Why do I point that out? I point that out to try and give you this example of the analogy I'm trying to draw with regards to courage and fear. Courage is strength in the face of fear. It's enduring in the face of it despite it anyway, right? It's being absolutely afraid out of your mind, potentially, and enduring anyway, right? Keep marching forward. That's what it is with faith and doubt, right? Doubt is definitely the opposite of faith. It is, in fact, the absence of faith, okay? That's true. However, true courage or true faith is persevering and trusting in God despite the doubt. See how it's the same relationship between courage and fear? It's the exact same. It's the presence of the principle, in this case, fear or doubt, and then the virtue that actually only comes about in spite of the principle. So courage to fear or faith to doubt, right? That's the problem with the JW view, and this is all cultic groups. I'm saying it's not just them, it's every cultic organisation ever, is that doubt is immediately viewed as the dialectic opposite of faith, and that any doubt is automatic sign of apostasy. It's a sign. The very doubting, the very questioning is taboo and off limits. Right? It's a very different way of approaching things than what the Bible actually explains or what God explains about faith and doubt interacting, right? Classic tactic that what it does, ultimately, the purpose is to snuff out any questioning. Right? Mental control. So, last section here, emotional control. Kind of obviously feeding on the back of mental, obviously those two things kind of two sides of the same coin. But nevertheless, the kind of constant fear of certain eschatological events, because eschatology is a huge section for them. Obviously, the whole organisation was founded by Russell's reinterpretation of all manner of biblical texts and about his famous, or I suppose these days, infamous prophecy of the return of Christ in a number of years, but probably most famously 1914. Of course, that didn't happen, and so then it was reinterpreted as an invisible reign. He's reigning spiritually in heaven. This is exactly what Ellen G. White did in the Jehovah's Witnesses. In the Seventh-day Adventists. She had the same thing that she did in 1873, I believe the year was. Joseph Smith and the Mormons effectively did the same thing as well. We talked a bit last week about the Millerites and the Great Disappointment in 1833 and then 1844. This is all feeding off of this kind of idea. But nevertheless, the constant kind of fear of all these eschatological things like Armageddon and Satan and what they call disfellowshipping or shunning, right? So in other words, being kicked out of the organisation, which for a lot of them, keep in mind, means getting even kicked out of your own family, if your family is JW. These kinds of things are very, very serious, and they have massive implication on the way that these kind of groups or organisations function. For them, this as well extends to the very concept of dying in sin, because they have an almost Roman, well, I don't say almost Roman, it actually really kind of extends even beyond the Roman Catholic position. Rome, for about at least the last 1,000 years at least, has had the position that there is a distinction between venial sins and mortal sins. We don't have time to explain what that means, but venial sins are minor sins, different things from mortal sins are very serious sins that put you outside of a state of grace, that you need to be back into a state of grace in order to enter into heaven. They take that concept and actually multiply that by about 100, right? Because that's a problem in itself, although it does have some biblical root, but it's a problem, it's a big problem. They take that and actually go the whole concept of falling in and out of state of grace at all in regards to their sin. So every single sin that they commit could potentially be sending them to hell. Do you know what I'm saying too? There's no perenniality to the sacrifice of Christ. There is no total removal of guilt as occurs in justification in the Bible, etc., etc. All these kinds of things are used to emotionally manipulate, right? Especially around some of the more theological things like Armageddon and all these kinds of things, right? Keeping people in a constant state of fear about the end times are right around the corner, which they've done over and over and over again, been doing that since 1914. It's never happened, right? And eventually at some point you'd figure it out, but we'll talk about that in the next slide. The heavy use of guilt and shame. Guilt and shame are two different things. I guess they're two sides of the same coin. Guilt is more judicial, shame is more moral. But nevertheless, the usage of guilt and shame to kind of enforce loyalty to the organisation and to their local kingdom halls, etc., is something which is obviously replete as well. Shunning, which is that term I used earlier, back in the earlier lesson. So being, in other words, shunned or cut off from any, not just fellowship, but association with any JW is a really powerful tool that they have, especially as I just mentioned earlier, it relates to family, right? So it's not just merely because they have the aspect of disassociation, not just disfellowship from your JW church, but disassociation from any JW person. If a son or a daughter, I'm just picking something random, leaves the JWs, they are by definition leaving the family, right? So connection between parents and children, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, immediate bifurcation and complete and utter separation and cutting off all contact, all communication, never visit, never talk, never speak, never see, never do anything, right? So that fear of shunning from not just the kingdom hall, like the church, the congregation, but also families is one of the more powerful kind of psychological or emotional tools, right? That usually alone sometimes is enough to deter dissent, as I kind of mentioned there, and create a real kind of dependence on the organisation, not just locally, but even at the top level. All these various layers throughout these kind of four sections, as it were, are what then build this dependency, right? It's why we're referring to it as cultic characteristics. This is exactly what marks cults. Again, cult is it's a term that's evolved greatly over the centuries. It goes back to ancient times. Again, it's a Greek word, cultus, also via Latin. Its meaning has changed a lot, but generally what we call a cult is more of these characteristics. All these kinds of characteristics which are inherent and embedded in just literally the daily lives of the JWs are very straight down the line cultic behaviours, right? It's how they control individuals, families, congregations, and the rest and beyond that, right? So, last little section I just wanted to mention, we can actually talk about this elsewhere as well, but the three kind of big failed prophecies of the organisation, right? Come in 1914, 1925 and 1975 respectively. I did mention 1914 earlier in the lesson and last week, right? But Charles Taze Russell predicts the end of the world and the return of Christ a multitude of times, the most famous of which is kind of his last one in 1914. Russell dies in 1916, about 2 years after this time. But in 1914 he predicted the return of Christ and the end of the world, the beginning of a 1,000-year kingdom, again literal interpretation of all these kinds of eschatological texts. Obviously, we're still here. And so this was reinterpreted as the beginning of an invisible reign of Christ. He reigns in heaven now from 1914. Like I said earlier, that's taking a play out of Ellen G. White's book, because that's what she did. Joseph Smith sort of did the same thing, although it's not the same. But really, he's taking a page out of Ellen G. White's book, who did the exact same thing. And it's part of the beginning of exactly what we saw with Mormonism. Failed prophecy after failed prophecy after failed prophecy, that instead of being honest and transparent and just owning it, you only have two options. You either completely confess to your wrongdoing or you just double down. And every time with these kinds of organisations or people, we just see them doubling down. And so in this case, it was a reinterpretation. They could kind of somehow get away with that. But the problem is you can only get away with that trick once, right? You can only get away with Jesus will return and that doesn't happen But what we really meant was invisibly and spiritually, and that's why you can't see it. You can only run that trick once. You can't keep running that. So then when his successor, Rutherford, right, Judge Rutherford, predicts it again in 1925, right, he predicts, in this case actually specifically, something very different. He predicts the return of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, which, to give credit for creativity, no one had ever done that. Even Mormons didn't do that, Seventh-day Adventists didn't do that, no one had ever thought, there's nothing at all, even in the Bible, that even hints at, there's not even a passage you could necessarily reinterpret that I can think of that ever speaks of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob coming back. You can twist, Mormons did this, you can twist the return of Moses and Elijah, because they get referenced in Revelation, right? But that's just a reference to the law and the prophets, right? That's a whole different lesson. But you can kind of twist that at least. In fact, actually, even occurred once obviously in the gospel, actually twice that occurred, because some of the Jews interpreted that passage literally when it's actually allegorical or figurative, and they thought that John the Baptist was Elijah. And then at the crucifixion, when he started speaking Aramaic and said, Eloi, Eloi, which means my father, it's also the same root for the name Elijah. So some of them misinterpreted Jesus and thought, he's calling down Elijah to come and save him, right? So there's at least something you could incorrectly interpret there. The Abraham, Isaac and Jacob thing was just kind of a new act of entrepreneurial invention. And of course, shock horror, didn't happen, and Abraham, Isaac and Jacob were not resurrected in 1925. This led to a big exodus from the JWs. They lost a little over 75% of their numbers, right? So thank God for that, right? However, though, that comes with a very big asterisk, because the preponderance of that 75%, instead of leaving the JWs and actually just coming back to Christianity, instead formed their own splintered JW groups, right? They formed their own. So that's what I'm saying to you. It's kind of like with Mormonism. It's why I call it Mormonism, not how they would much rather be called themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or the LDS Church, because there's dozens of Mormon churches, or denominations effectively, right? There's dozens of Mormon organizations and denominations. It's no different with the JWs, just not quite as extensive as it is with the Mormons. There's multiple JW denominations, if you want to think of it that way, right? And they come from that big exodus and splinter that occurs in 1925. The difference is, however, and Rutherford kind of set the pattern for this, right? Russell lays obviously a lot of the foundation, but it's really his successor, Russell, who really shapes the way that the Watchtower has behaved now for 100 years. Obviously, it's literally 100 years since that period, 1925. Is that instead of taking the path that Russell used, which was reinterpretation, Rutherford comes along and instead shifts the response from reinterpretation to what I might just simply call blame. I could probably use different phrases here. Basically, the way since 1925 all the way through to today, 100 years literally, any time at all that the Watchtower organisation has said X, Y, Z, something will happen, or this is whatever, or this is what this means, and then a whole bunch of their people, it doesn't happen, and a whole bunch of their people are up in arms about it, instead of the original Russell version of 1914 reinterpretation, they take the Rutherford route, what I'm just calling the Rutherford route, which is saying, you have misinterpreted what we've said. Does that make sense? Okay. I know it's obviously painfully morally corrupt, but that's exactly what happened, right? So Rutherford's response to that was, you've all completely misunderstood and misinterpreted what's being said. Anyway, on to the next thing. Boom, 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 boom. Okay? It's exactly the same tactic they took in 1975. They had the organisation had another big return of Christ, end of the world, beginning of the millennium, which they interpret literally, thing, right? Prophecy. Obviously, shock horror 50 years later, proved to be false, right? And it did lead to another mass exodus. In this case, fortunately, a number of them actually did leave JWs for real. That's fortunate. Obviously, each time they recover those numbers, but it leads to these kind of roller coasters in terms of the numbers. But each time, including 1975, the response is basically one gigantic, highly sophisticated, quite well organised, to give the devil his due, operation of gaslighting, right? Just gaslight your entire organisation and people into thinking that, no, you've actually completely misinterpreted what we said, right? That's not what we meant. You're the ones who have misinterpreted it, right? The fault and the blame is on your part because you've tried to do private interpretation of the Word of God. See, that's cutting back to what we looked at earlier, right? The whole don't interpret the Bible for yourself thing, which again, in a general principle is actually a correct thing, but this case it's used as a weapon, right? You've all misinterpreted what's been said, right? Now, the very tiny olive branch I'll give is that you can, theoretically in life, have scenarios where you say something and the bulk of people listening to something misinterpret it. There's all kinds of reasons why that can happen. It's usually just contextual, but that can be very complex things, right? I've had that happen before where, not here, but at places before where I've spoken, right, where I've said something and it's very clear that the way that was understood was they had a different understanding of what that word meant, for example, or the concept we were referring to. They had a bunch of prior kind of presumptions of something they'd been taught about that subject. This is usually how it happens, of how they'd been taught about that subject that was actually very different to what I was saying. So the immediate reaction is, this guy's teaching heresy. I get that. I'm not, and I'll explain to you why, but I understand why you reacted that way, right? So that can happen. However, generally speaking, if the bulk of people, again, this is a general truth, not a universal one, but generally if a group of people are unified in their understanding of what you said, it's generally because you didn't do a good job communicating it, right? Generally. Not always, but generally. In this case, however, this is one of those completely morally bankrupt scenarios where no one was under any confusion as to what was being said. Like Rutherford just straight up said that the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac and Jacob are going to be resurrected in 1925. There's nothing really complex about that. And instead of at least I'm saying to you, you can only run that 1914 tactic once. It only works once, because if he comes along and says, well, yeah, they'll be resurrected in 1925, but spiritually resurrected. Well, you can't just. But how do you? You can't just keep running that same play before people start catching on, right? So instead of that, he knew full well that when this didn't happen, you have to just basically gaslight your own people into. That's not what I meant. That's not what we said. This is what happens when you privately interpret things. This is why you need the Watchtower organisation to interpret it for you. And that's just the play they've run ever since, right? So every single time this organisation has these failed prophecies, they completely gaslight their own people into believing, through the kind of techniques we talked about earlier, emotional manipulation, mental manipulation, informational control, those kinds of things, that you are all now doubting. This is not what we said. That's not what we said. We didn't say that. That's not what that means. This is why you can't interpret what we say. We're the ones who interpret it because we're the infallible authority from God. And so you need to listen to what we say and listen to the interpretation. That's not what we interpret, even in times where it completely contradicts, right? They actually take an even more, at least the Mormons just basically reinterpret their stuff and then just kind of try to move on as quickly as they can, right? So that you hopefully don't notice that they had a completely different view of the exact same subject like 40 years ago or something, right? The JWs take an even more obviously corrupt stance, or tactic, I should really say, strategy, in that the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac and Jacob will be resurrected in 1925. It doesn't happen. Rutherford, why didn't it happen? That's not what we said. We didn't say that. That's not what we meant. What? You're lying about us. You're slandering us. That's not what we said. That never happened. It's just completely gaslighting, right? Now, like, obviously, if you ask the JWs about any of this, they'll deny this till the cows come home. But of course they deny this till the cows come home because of how badly this reflects. So you can't ask the JWs about this, right? But this is just objective, open source history. Like, it doesn't take you 5 to 10 minutes to figure out this kind of stuff. It's not hidden. It's not secret. It's all right there. Like, Rutherford just straight up predicted that they would come back from the dead in 1925. And 75, and et cetera, right? But those are the three big ones. And I point that out because this is the pattern of how this organisation works, is that it shockingly manipulates and gaslights its own people in these kinds of regards. So that's the end. That's given you at least a decent enough overview of the organisation and how it tends to operate. Again, do keep in mind, I'm heavily synthesising material, I'm heavily summarising material, right? It's not meant to be an expansive lesson in this kind of case. You could just spend 20 lessons talking about the organisation as a whole. But we're trying to get a picture of who they are. We're trying to get a picture of how they operate. And again, all this stuff, it's not some esoteric knowledge. This is easily accessible historical data that demonstrates this pattern of behaviour and how they operate, let alone if you actually just talk to JWs that have come out of it. We used to have former JWs here, the Harrises. They now live up in the Hunter, but they used to be part of the Kingdom Hall in Katoomba here for quite a while, actually. Many, many, many years. I think actually more than a decade, actually. And Lauren, young Lauren, the daughter, then converted out, and then not long after the mother came out, right? And so praise God, right? So we have some. So there was, again, I know them well. Obviously, was their pastor for a while before they moved out to the Hunter. But any discussion with former JWs reveals all this information, right? Because they all have the same story. They all have been in the organisation, they come out of it, and they have the exact same story to tell. No one speaks of their former time of JWs with this great endearment, right? Obviously, maybe individuals, like there's plenty of nice people who are JWs, they're usually really friendly, but that doesn't, the personal niceness of the individuals or families doesn't alter how the organisation works, you know what I'm saying? And so, yeah, this is the state of this organisation. And you'll see how that plays out through much of what we'll look at in terms of the New World Translation. That's what we'll look at in the next lesson, okay? Because obviously this kind of informational control is centred heavily around their own translation of the Bible, right, and how they control that. We're going to look at that specifically, including getting into some of the nitty-gritty in the Greek as well, right? So I'll try and do my best to show that to you on screen so that you can see some of those things, how they actually work, even with the original languages. We'll do that in the next lesson, and then as well as the theology lessons that will come after that, all right? Cool. So, thank you. Yeah. No, sure. So why have the JWs been outlawed in certain countries and not Mormons? Look, it's really probably, this would be I'm speculating here obviously because it's not like there's some official statement. There's really kind of twofold reasons. At least this would be my more academic assessment, for whatever it's worth. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, they were suppressed. Yes. Yeah. My two primary reasons would probably be as follows if I was to give a more serious opinion. The one would be the more behavioural aspects I mentioned earlier, so the nature of their organisational practices. Obviously, yes, the Mormons are very heavily, they evangelise all the time, but the JWs do way more. They're much more public, they're much more in the face, right? Mormons don't do door-to-door, at least not generally speaking. It's very rare. They're missionary. Yeah, you usually see them in their black pants, their white shirt, their black tie. That's their standard elder uniform. On a bicycle, usually, if they're travelling around. God bless them. But they do, again, plenty of missionary work. They're all over the place. But it's a different tactic, right? And so the JWs being much more heavy on the evangelism side and the direct face-to-face contact, especially door-to-door, public places, this and that, has a much broader and heavier and more obvious public facing, which makes it stand out more, if that makes any sense. Part of it then also too comes in the fact that on the flip side of that, or really I suppose in tandem to that, is organisational size and strength. By strength, what I really mean is financial and political influence, right? The Mormons are a far wealthier organisation than the JWs. In fact, religiously speaking, there is no one wealthier than the Mormon Church. People in the modern day whinge and moan about how many assets the Roman Catholic Church has, which amounts to about, roughly speaking, 13, 14 billion in global assets. Well, the Mormons have over 250 billion. A billion, yeah. Land holdings, buildings, trusts, foundations, companies, shelf companies, etc. Various different assets, on-paper assets, on-sheet assets. Yeah, it's not even close. And keeping in mind that that's 13 to 14-ish, like let's just call it 13 billion roughly for the Roman Catholic Church, and that's existed for 2,000 years. The Mormons outpace that literally 20 to 1, right? And they've been around for 5 minutes compared to the Roman Church. And so it's not even close. So the amount of power and influence that can be wielded by that is far greater, especially if it comes to geopolitics or international diplomacy. I've got zero problems, by the way, with Russia or Norway or any of the African countries banning those organisations. That's not the problem. I know that offends our modern Western kind of democratic liberal ideals, but I'm not concerned with that. But it's usually just basically, I would say those are the two biggest reasons. Overt public-facing interaction combined with much less financial and political power or weight they can throw around, if that makes sense. Yeah, that would be the two biggest reasons. If that answers that question, yeah, cool. Yeah. How did the Mormon Church get so wealthy compared to the Romans? The two factors really. One is, well, like with anything else, usually location. So in the case of the Mormons, they effectively conquer Utah, obviously in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. The Utah Wars, we didn't look specifically at the Utah Wars. We looked at mainly the Missouri Wars and the Illinois Wars. The Mormon Wars in Utah were the next generation under Brigham Young and others, right? By virtue of the conquest of that territory, which was unorganized at the time, what today is the state of Utah in the mountain west of America, it gave them a base. It gave them assets and resources in Utah, mining especially, like with the other American mountain west states of Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, even down to Arizona and New Mexico. Silver mining, gold mining is massive, coal, transportation, railroad lines. So actual industry gave them a very big base in Utah. And from there, expanding outward to the rest of the United States, just the general wealth of the Americans has propelled them along those lines. And so as they spread around, they accumulate real estate heavily, very heavily, but beyond what churches traditionally do. So again, churches, there's nothing wrong with that aspect. Like churches obviously need land and churches and other such kind of things. But the difference is that the Mormon, I'm oversimplifying here, but just for the sake of time, this gets the picture across. They will buy land for a local Mormon stake, what they call it, a church, and then they'll go and buy like 5 apartment complexes right nearby. Do you know what I'm saying too? So it's like, they're very modern in their economics. That's how they've, especially through the 20th century, that's really how they've accumulated a lot of that. Yeah, they're on, like I said, they're on sheet assets. It's just astronomical. There's literally no one bigger. Not the Roman Catholic Church, not Islam, not Hindu. Name something. It's not even close. Yeah. So that's generally how. Yes. Location in Utah, effectively conquering what would become its own state, spreading out there from America, and then just the inertia of the American economy. Yeah. Good question.